"I want a child with you, cowboy," said the giant Apache woman. The sun was just beginning to set over the vast plains, casting an orange glow over the rugged landscape. The cowboy, a man who had spent most of his life out in the wilderness, was making his way back to the small cabin he called home. His boots kicked up dust as his horse trotted along the dirt path, the only sound breaking the quiet of the open land. He had been out for weeks, rounding up stray cattle and ensuring his herd was secure, but today felt different. There was an uneasy feeling in the air, like something was about to change, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he neared a small creek that ran through the valley, he saw movement ahead. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the wind, or perhaps a deer, but as he got closer, he saw her clearly. She was standing by the creek, her back to him, looking out over the water as though lost in thought. Her long, dark hair was tied back, and her clothes were a mixture of furs and leather that looked worn but functional. She was tall, taller than most women the cowboy had met. Her presence was commanding, like the land itself, untamed and fierce. For a moment, he wondered if he should turn around and leave her to whatever business she had, but something held him there. Maybe it was the loneliness of the open plains, or maybe it was the sense of adventure that had always been part of his nature. He rode closer, the horse's hooves softly thudding against the earth. When she turned to face him, the cowboy was taken aback. She wasn't just tall. She had a strength in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Her gaze was direct, almost as if she was sizing him up, and yet there was a softness there, too. It wasn't the kind of look a man would get from a woman who was afraid of him. It was the look of someone who had seen much and understood even more. "You're far from home, cowboy," she said, her voice strong but with an edge of curiosity. The cowboy didn't know how to answer at first. He had spent his life alone, or at least with men who were more concerned with cattle and campfires than conversation. But there was something about this woman that made him feel like he should say something. "I guess you could say that," he replied, tipping his hat, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You're not from around here either, are you?" She gave a slight nod. "No, I'm Apache." The word hung in the air between them for a moment. The cowboy was no stranger to the Apache people. He had heard the stories of the fierce warriors, the leaders who fought to protect their land. But seeing her here, standing so calmly, made him think twice about everything he had been taught. "I'm a long way from home, too," he said, breaking the silence. "Cattle just don't stay put when you want 'em to." The woman didn't smile, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "They never do," she said. "But then again, neither do men like you." The cowboy's brow furrowed, unsure of what she meant. But before he could ask, she turned back to the creek. There was something about the way she moved, graceful, almost like she belonged to the land itself. "I've heard rumors," she continued, her voice low, almost to herself, "of a cowboy who rides the plains with no place to call home. But you don't seem like the type to get lost." He didn't know why, but her words made him uneasy. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on being a man who could handle anything that came his way. But this woman, standing in front of him, seemed to know more about him than he was comfortable with. "Maybe I'm just tired of riding alone," he admitted, his voice softening. It was the first time he had said it out loud. The woman didn't turn around, but he could hear the slight shift in her stance. "The land has a way of making people feel that way," she said, as if speaking from experience. "But the thing about loneliness is that it's easier to face when you know you're not the only one carrying it." There was a long pause. The cowboy didn't know what to say next. He wasn't used to sharing his thoughts with anyone, especially not someone he had just met in the middle of nowhere. But there was something about her that made him feel like maybe it was worth opening up. I've spent my whole life on the move, he said quietly, never staying in one place for too long. Always pushing forward, thinking it was the only way to survive. She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment she spoke again. Survival is a hard way to live, but there's more to life than surviving. The cowboy considered her words, his gaze drifting over the landscape around them. The vast, open plains stretched out before him, endless and empty. Was this what he had been fighting for all these years? A life that was just about getting by? I don't know if I'm ready for anything more, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned to look at him then, her eyes locking with his. There was something powerful in that gaze, something that made him feel like she could see right through him, to the heart of who he really was. You'll know when the time comes, she said simply. But until then, you're not the only one on this land. The cowboy didn't know what to make of her words, but he felt a shift in the air. The tension between them, the strange pull that had kept him there, was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. Something deeper, something that he couldn't explain, was beginning to grow inside him. I'll be going now, she said, and without another word she turned and walked away, her footsteps steady and sure. The cowboy watched her go, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He didn't know what had just happened, but he felt like he had just crossed a line that he couldn't go back from. As he rode away, the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that he had just met someone who would change his life forever. Days passed after the cowboy's first meeting with the Apache woman by the creek. Every evening when he returned to his small cabin, the image of her stood clearly in his mind. It was as though her presence had burned itself into his thoughts, never quite leaving. The wild beauty of the plains was always there, but something about the way she had looked at him, with those piercing eyes, stayed with him more than anything. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. There was something in the way she spoke, so direct and sure of herself. She wasn't like the women he had known, gentle, soft-spoken, always waiting for someone to decide for them. No, this Apache woman had a strength that was undeniable. It wasn't just in the way she held herself, though. That was certainly impressive. It was in the way she spoke of survival in the land, as if she had been shaped by it and could not be broken by it. The cowboy didn't know what he had expected from their meeting, but it certainly hadn't been that. At first, he had thought she might be like any other stranger he met out here, just passing through. But now, there was something more. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. There was a connection between them, something that was unspoken but clear. That weeks went by and the cowboy found himself returning to the creek more often. He had no real reason for it, other than the hope that she might be there. He had tried to shake the thought of her, focusing instead on his work, on the cattle, on the endless trail he had always followed. But every time he thought about heading back home, the thought of her would nag at him. He couldn't help it. It was like an itch that he couldn't scratch. On one of these visits to the creek, he found her again. She was sitting on a rock by the water, her legs crossed, watching the ripples in the creek. For a moment, the cowboy just stood there, watching her. The way she was so still, so at peace with herself, made him pause. It was strange to see someone who had so clearly found their place in the world. He didn't know if he would ever feel that kind of peace, but in that moment, he realized how much he wanted to. "You keep coming back," she said, not looking at him, but knowing he was there. "I guess I do," the cowboy said with a slight grin, walking closer. He had no real plan for what to say next, just hoping the conversation would go somewhere. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze. "You're not used to being still, are you?" The cowboy paused, not sure how to answer. It was true. He had never stayed in one place for too long. His life was always on the move. Ranching, cattle drives, fixing fences, chasing after the next thing. He never let himself stop, always pushing forward. It was easier that way, he thought. But standing here now, watching her, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice softer than he intended. "I've never really had the chance to stay still, not like this." The Apache woman studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You're afraid of stopping," she said, her tone almost matter-of-fact. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He hadn't realized it until she said it, but she was right. He was afraid of what might happen if he stopped moving, if he stayed in one place for too long. What would that mean for him? For his life? Would he be trapped? Stuck in the same place forever? "I suppose I am," he admitted. "I've never stayed in one place long enough to find out." She smiled then, a small, knowing smile. "The land doesn't care if you stay or leave. It will be here, long after you're gone." The cowboy felt a strange sensation in his chest at her words. It was both comforting and unsettling. She spoke with such certainty, as if she knew things he didn't. Things he hadn't even thought about. "Is that what you've learned?" he asked, his voice a bit rough. "That the land doesn't care?" She nodded slowly, standing up from her spot by the creek. "The land gives us what we need, and we take what it offers. But it's not personal. It doesn't hold on to anything. We do that to ourselves." Her words hung in the air for a moment, and the cowboy found himself lost in thought. He had always seen the land as something to conquer, something to control. But here she was, a woman of the land, telling him it wasn't something to fight. It was something to respect. "I've spent my life fighting," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Fighting to make something of myself, to carve out a life. But it always feels like I'm fighting against something I can't see." She stepped closer to him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You're not fighting the land, cowboy. You're fighting yourself." Her words struck him hard, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had never thought about it that way. He had always thought of himself as a man of action, a man who had to keep moving in order to survive. But now, standing here, he was beginning to wonder if that was all just a way of running from something. "I don't know if I can stop," he said, his voice filled with a quiet uncertainty. "I don't know if I know how." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, with a soft sigh, she placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like more than that. It felt like she was offering him something he hadn't been willing to accept before. "You don't have to stop all at once," she said. "But maybe, just for a moment, you can stop fighting. Maybe, just for a little while, you can let yourself be still." The cowboy looked at her then, really looked at her. She was standing there, so calm, so sure of herself, and for the first time in his life he wondered if he could be like that too. If he could stop running, stop fighting, and just be. Maybe," he whispered, almost to himself. She smiled at him then, and it wasn't a smile of pity or sympathy. It was the smile of someone who understood. "I'll be here," she said, turning back to the creek, "whenever you're ready to stop running." As he watched her, the cowboy felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a sudden change, but a small shift, a realization that maybe he had been fighting the wrong battles all along. Maybe it wasn't about conquering the land or running from his past. Maybe it was about finding peace. And for the first time, he wondered if that was possible. The cowboy's heart raced as he sat by the campfire that night, the crackling flames illuminating his weathered face. His thoughts were consumed by the words the Apache woman had spoken earlier that day. He couldn't stop thinking about them. "You're fighting yourself." It wasn't the first time someone had tried to make him face the truth about his life, but somehow this felt different. She wasn't like the others who had offered advice or sympathy. There was no pity in her words. She had spoken with such quiet strength, like she had known the battle he fought every day. He shifted uncomfortably on the log, rubbing his hands together to warm them. It wasn't the cold of the night that made him uneasy, but the weight of what she had said. What if she was right? What if everything he had been running from, everything he had been fighting, wasn't the land or the people around him, but himself? The fire flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the ground. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, a man who didn't dwell on things, who didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. But lately, everything felt different. He had always known he was lonely, but he had never really thought about why. The thought of staying in one place, of opening himself up to someone, terrified him. It was easier to keep moving, to keep his heart closed off. He looked up at the stars, feeling small beneath the vastness of the night sky. The world seemed so large, so full of possibilities, but it also felt so distant. How many times had he thought he was in control, that he had everything figured out, only to find that it was all slipping through his fingers? A rustling sound broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see the Apache woman standing a few feet away, watching him with a steady gaze. She had arrived quietly, as she always did, like a shadow in the night. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "You didn't," the cowboy replied, sitting up straighter. "I was just thinking." She nodded and sat down beside him, her movements graceful and confident, as if she had always belonged to this place, to the earth beneath them. She didn't say anything at first, simply gazing into the fire as the heat from the flames warmed them both. They sat there for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind whispering through the trees. The cowboy found comfort in the silence, but it was also unsettling. He didn't know what to say to her, didn't know how to explain the whirlwind of thoughts that had been spinning through his mind all day. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've been thinking about what I said, haven't you?" The cowboy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I have." He rubbed his hand across his face. "It's not easy, you know, to just stop fighting, to face what's inside instead of always running from it." She turned to look at him, her expression calm but understanding. "No one ever said it would be easy, but sometimes the hardest thing is the right thing to do." The cowboy let out a long sigh, the weight of his own uncertainty pressing down on him. "I don't know if I can do it. I've been on the move my whole life. It's who I am, or at least who I've told myself I am. I don't know what it would be like to stop, to settle down." She looked at him with a kind of softness in her eyes that he hadn't expected. "It's not about stopping, cowboy. It's about finding peace, and peace doesn't come from running. It comes from within." His chest tightened at her words. Peace. That was the one thing he had never truly found. No matter how much he had tried to outrun it, peace always felt just out of reach, like something he could never quite hold on to. He glanced at her, his voice low. "How do you know all this? How do you know what it feels like?" She was quiet for a moment, her gaze still focused on the fire. Then, slowly, she spoke. "Because I've had to learn it myself. I've had to learn that peace isn't something you find by running away. It's something you create within yourself, no matter where you are." Her words resonated with him more than he had expected. There was a quiet wisdom in her, something he couldn't quite put into words. She had lived a life of struggle, of survival, and yet she spoke as if she had come to a place of understanding that he could only dream of. "I don't know if I can do it," he repeated, more to himself than to her. "I don't know if I can let go of everything I've been holding on to." She turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. "You don't have to let go all at once. It's a process. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to have everything figured out right now." The cowboy swallowed hard, feeling the knot in his throat tighten. She was right. He didn't have to have it all figured out. Maybe that was the problem all along. He had been trying to force himself to have all the answers when the truth was, he didn't even know where to begin. The night seemed to stretch on forever as they sat there together, the flickering fire between them. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, he felt like he didn't have to have all the answers right away. Maybe the first step was just being willing to listen, to stop running and truly hear what was being said. "I don't know where to start," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've already started," she replied softly, "by being here, by listening." The cowboy looked at her, seeing her for the first time in a way that felt different, more than just the woman who had caught his attention, more than just the stranger by the creek. She was someone who had been through her own struggles, someone who understood what it meant to survive and, more importantly, to find meaning in the struggle. "I think you're right," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a new sense of resolve. "Maybe I've been running for too long." She smiled then, a small, knowing smile. "It's not too late to stop running, and it's not too late to find peace." For the first time in what felt like forever, the cowboy felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe he didn't need them right now. Maybe, for the first time, he could just let himself breathe. As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the night grew colder, the cowboy sat there beside her, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he wasn't afraid to take the next step. The days continued to pass, and as time went on, the cowboy found himself coming to terms with the changes in his life. He still spent his days working the land, but something inside him had shifted. He couldn't exactly explain it, but he felt different, more aware, more present in the world around him. It was as if the weight that had always pressed on his chest was slowly lifting piece by piece. The Apache woman's words echoed in his mind, and he had taken them to heart. He didn't know what peace really felt like until now. For the first time, he wasn't running from his past. He wasn't trying to outrun the loneliness that had always haunted him. Instead, he was learning to face it, to sit with it, and to understand it. The cowboy often found himself wandering the same paths he had walked before, but with a different perspective. The landscape, once harsh and unforgiving, now seemed to offer its own kind of beauty. He started to notice the small things, the way the light filtered through the trees in the morning, the delicate rustling of leaves in the breeze, the way the land seemed to stretch endlessly before him, inviting him to explore. He had never looked at the world this way before. The endless horizon had always felt like a reminder of how far he had to go, of how much he still needed to achieve. But now it felt like an invitation to simply exist, to live in the moment rather than constantly striving for something just beyond his reach. One afternoon, after a long day of rounding up cattle, the cowboy found himself walking down the familiar path toward the creek once again. He had stopped going there for a while, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he had been trying to figure things out on his own. He had been thinking a lot about what she had said. That peace came from within. And though he hadn't fully understood it at the time, he was beginning to see it for himself. When he reached the creek, he found her there, just as he had the first time. She was sitting on the same rock, her legs crossed, her eyes closed as if she were listening to the land itself. She didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, she seemed to have been expecting him. "I thought I might find you here," he said, walking up to her slowly. She opened her eyes and gave him a small smile, her expression calm and serene. "I knew you would come back," she said simply. "You've been finding your way." The cowboy sat down next to her, his hands resting on his knees as he gazed out at the water. "I don't know if I've found my way yet, but I'm starting to understand what you meant about peace." She nodded as if she had known all along that this was the next step for him. "It's a journey," she said quietly. "A long one, but you're walking it now." The cowboy was silent for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the creek, the sound of the water flowing gently over the rocks. For the first time, he wasn't trying to rush through life. He wasn't looking for something to fix or a problem to solve. He was simply being. "I've been running from so much," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I thought that if I just kept moving, I could outrun everything. My past, my fears, my loneliness. But I see now, it's not about running. It's about staying." She looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. Staying isn't always easy, but it's the only way to truly find what you're looking for. You can't keep running forever. He let out a long sigh, the weight of his thoughts settling in his chest. "I don't know if I'm ready for everything that comes with staying, with settling down." Her voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time. No one expects you to have all the answers." The cowboy felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a simple statement, but it gave him permission to take things at his own pace. He didn't have to know everything. He didn't have to have it all planned out. He could just be where he was, in that moment, with no pressure to be anything else. The sky above them was beginning to change, the colors of the sunset painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange. The cowboy took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool evening air. There was something about the stillness of the moment that made him feel more connected to the world around him than ever before. "I've spent my life trying to control everything," he said, his voice steady, "trying to force things to go the way I want them to. But I think I've been doing it all wrong. Maybe it's time to stop trying to control everything and just let things happen." The Apache woman smiled at him, her eyes soft with wisdom. "Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means accepting what is without trying to change it. And when you do that, things fall into place." For the first time in a long time, the cowboy felt a sense of calm settle over him. It was as if a door had opened inside him, and he was beginning to see things more clearly. He didn't have to fight so hard. He didn't have to keep running. All he had to do was trust the process, trust that everything would unfold as it was meant to. The evening wore on, and the cowboy and the Apache woman sat in silence, watching the sunset as the colors in the sky deepened into twilight.